Hey everyone, so we started a new conversation this week at Snapshot. We're talking about creation. We're asking the big question, did God really create everything? And if he did he have a purpose for it? Why? Why did he create the universe? Why did he create animals and plants? And why did he create us? All right, why did he make Earth the way it was? So we're going to dive into that. And we started by talking about Genesis chapters 1 and 2, and I want you guys to actually read Genesis chapters 1 and 2 this week, so you can be ready for what we talk about next week, right? It's a good way to start, and we'll talk about some of the differences, and also some of the similarities in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 next week. So make sure you read it before you come. It'll take you 10 minutes at most. It'll be good. All right, but the word Genesis actually means in the beginning. In Hebrew, it literally means in the beginning, right? So that's what it is. It's a book about beginnings. In Greek, the word Genesis means origins, right? Or birth, right? It's talking about when the universe was birthed, when it was created, which means there was a point where it was not, right? And most of us believe that it had to come from somewhere. It's not just that it always was. So there's a whole lot of speculation around what that could look like. But we're looking at the Genesis accounts, and those were written to specific people. That was written to the Jewish people. And most people believe that Moses wrote the book of Genesis and a bunch of stuff in the Old Testament that we call the Pentateuch, the books of the law. Because remember, Moses led the people out of Egypt through mighty wonders. God helped him part the Red Sea, and then Moses brought the Ten Commandments down from Mount Sinai because Moses was meeting with God there. He was face to face with God, hanging out with him, learning from him. And then Moses brings back the word to the people. So Moses wrote all of this down. God was probably teaching him amazing things like Genesis, trying to help him figure out what does that look like? How do we tell people about that? Because where the Jewish people were, after they got out of Egypt, they were surrounded by tons of other nations that had all of their own ideas about how the world came into being, about why they were there, right? I mean, it's a question that we're still asking today. How did all of this happen and why are we here? It's the same question that they were asking back then, right? And they had a bunch of different myths around how the world was created, right? One of the most popular ones was that there were two dueling forces, eternal forces. Sometimes they would take animal shapes, and the animal shapes would fight each other, and one of them would get hurt, and they'd lose an arm or their intestines would spill out, and that's how we got the stars in the sky, and that's where we all came from this cosmic fight of good and evil or something like that. And that's what most of the nations around the Jewish people believed after they got out of Egypt, right? And God wanted to make sure that's not exactly how it happened, right? God wanted them to know what it was like. So he gave Moses Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 as more of an anti-myth as opposed to a science textbook. Because remember, what we think of as science and scientific method didn't start until 200-300 years ago in earnest. And this was way before the birth of Jesus. So, I mean, we're talking a very long time ago that this happened, up to 4,000 years ago, right? Like, this isn't... So when we read Genesis, it's not going to answer questions about that you have that are scientific, right? It's not going to do it. It might speak to them in some way, but it's not going to be a textbook science answer on what it is. And if you're looking for Genesis to do that, you're not reading it correctly, right? You don't read a book of poems to figure out math equations. It's not how it works. That's not what poems are. They're not math equations. They're poems. And Genesis, again, was an anti-myth because of all the stuff that the nations around the Jewish people believed, right? And the main thing that it was trying to get across is that God created everything. He is all-powerful, and He created everything. He was alone in the universe. He is sovereign. There's no dueling force against Him. And He created, because only He is eternal. And He created with love and a purpose. Not just that He made things to do stuff for Him because He needed things done for Him, but He did it with love, and He did it with a purpose, to have relationship with His creation, to take joy in it, right? And Paul understood this, and he spoke to people, and that we see it in Acts chapter 17, verses 22 through 26. And Paul is under house arrest in Rome. He's waiting for his trial in front of the Roman emperor to tell this Roman emperor about Jesus, this Roman emperor who thinks he's a god himself, right? Paul does not get very far with him, but he still wants to tell this guy about Jesus. So he's waiting for he's under house arrest because he stirred up all this trouble telling people about Jesus, and the Jews didn't like it. So Paul's like, fine, go ahead, send me to Rome. I'll talk to the emperor. It's my right as a Roman citizen. So he's there, and in Rome, there are these guys that meet every day, and they talk about these big ideas. They talk about philosophy and ask why are things the way they are? How did the world come to be? They have all these giant conversations, and Paul joins in after a while. He goes and just listens, and then finally he joins in. And this is an account of when he joins in. And again, in Acts chapter 17, verses 22 through 26. So Paul, standing before the council, addressed them as follows. Men of Athens, I notice that you are very religious in every way. For as I was walking along, I saw your many shrines and temples. And on one of your altars had this inscription on it, to an unknown God. This God, whom you worship without knowing, is the one I'm going to tell you about. So he knows that they believe in all these different gods and all these different things that came together to make the world the way it is. And he says, but the Romans didn't want to miss out on one. So they made an altar to this unknown God. And Paul comes up and he says, you know what? I know that unknown God. He is the only God, the creator of everything. And this is what he goes on to say in verse 24. He says, he is the God who made the world and everything in it. Since he is Lord of heaven and earth, he doesn't live in man-made temples, right? These things that you guys built, they're not for God, right? Like, he doesn't need them, right? And he says, and human hands can't serve his needs, for he has no needs. We can't do anything for him. He's God. He himself gives life and breath to everything, and he satisfies every need. From one man he created all nations throughout the whole earth, and he decided beforehand when they should rise and fall and determine their boundaries. He set the nations out, right? So Paul gets up and says, you guys are so scared that you're going to miss worshiping a God and you're going to offend a God. He says, but this God that you don't know is the one who made everything, right? And that's what Moses was trying to get across in Genesis 2. There is one God, one creator, and he made everything, and he made everything with love and with purpose. So that's what we're going to start out talking about this week. And I just want you to think about that. Like, God made things with love and purpose. And ask that question. Look at creation around you. Look at people and say, man, did God create that with love and purpose? And try and understand what that might look like. And read Genesis 1 and 2 and see how God created with love and purpose. And we'll talk more about it next week. Love you guys. Have an awesome week.